As we begin, I'd like you to imagine yourself walking through a shadowy forest. Right, your heart is pounding, and suddenly your traveling companion starts yelling, "Lions and tigers and bears, oh my! Lions and tigers and bears, oh my!" Right, most of you can picture this image in your mind. Right, you recognize this comes from The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, they're nervously entering into the woods, unsure of what frightening creatures they might encounter. But when we turn to the Bible, that famous phrase, "with just a slight twist," brings us to Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel sees not a lion, tiger, and a bear, but something like a lion, a leopard, and a bear, followed by this fourth creature that is so strange and terrifying that it sort of defies description. It's a kind of super beast. And unlike the beasts in The Wizard of Oz, which are in the woods, these beasts in Daniel's visions connect in some way to these human rulers, these empires in the world. And as I hope we'll see at the end of this message, maybe Daniel's vision even invites us to ask whether these beasts in some way live on, that they're represented by some actions that we ourselves sometimes engage in. Now, this part of Daniel has been on my mind for quite a while, and I felt led to talk about it. It's not one that we hear a whole lot, and it is really strange. And so if you ever think of your Bible as boring, just open up to Daniel 7 again and remember this passage. But I was a bit hesitant to do so because there is so much in this chapter to unpack, and I won't have time in the next 20 minutes to get through everything. I also know how much people disagree over these apocalyptic texts, over the interpretation of these types of texts. But it is a text that's been on my mind quite a bit. I taught a class on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, and if you read the New Testament, what you find out is this passage is quoted multiple times. It's found on the lips of Jesus multiple times. Right? It's in Matthew, it's in Revelation, it is there, and so clearly it's important. And so I hope you will journey with me into this vision, into this text that makes us process human nature really in a unique way, and more importantly, points us to Christ as the true human, the Son of Man. Now, before we get into the fireworks of the beast rising out of this chaotic sea and then being conquered, I think we need a little background on Daniel. Now, as most of you know, the first half of Daniel is going to recount these stories of the Israelites in exile. Right? They were forced from their homes and taken to Babylon. They're living in a foreign land under the rule of this oppressive beast. I mean empire. Right? A nation who has taken them from their homes dictates to them what they can eat, who they can worship, who they can pray to. Right? There's no doubt that in a situation like this, the average Israelite that's been exiled from their home is struggling to maintain faith, struggling to maintain hope, struggling to maintain the belief that God is still on the throne as you think about all the things that they're going through. And so the early chapters of Daniel provide us with some famous stories that you probably know well, of what the empire did to some of these individuals who had been exiled, to Daniel, to Shadrach, to Meshach, and Abednego. Right? It shows us how these four maintained their faith despite being sentenced to death. And I'm, of course, referring to those stories, the fiery furnace, and of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. Right? These four become models of resistance, and they are faithful in exile. Now, it's immediately after these stories that we read about this dream of these devouring beasts. Now, as a whole, the book of Daniel is split into these two main parts. Chapters 1 to 6 are these stories of exile, and chapters 7 to 12 are these apocalyptic visions. Despite this clear and dramatic shift between the genres of these two parts, there's a clue that they are woven together. The book is written part in Hebrew and part in Aramaic. You open up the book, you start reading, it's Hebrew, chapter 1. And all of a sudden it switches to Aramaic in chapter 2. And the Aramaic stays until you get to chapter 7, and then it goes back to Hebrew. Clearly, somebody has woven these two parts together intentionally, and you're meant to think about them together. Think about it. Chapters 1 to 6 show us rulers who throw innocent people into fire, into lions' dens, and then chapter 7 gives us a picture of these beasts, violent empires devouring everything in their path. Right? It's not a stretch to see a connection between these two parts. And in fact, the angel's interpretation of the dream in Daniel 7:17 makes it clear. The beasts in some ways represent a sequence of oppressive kings. Now, the real challenge, I think, of this text and how we understand this connection between real human kings and the symbols, the beasts in the vision. And people have debated this for a long, long time. And I don't have time to unpack everything from this text, but I want to focus on these two things. How to interpret apocalyptic texts like this, and then what it means personally for us. Now, historically, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of controversy over how to take and understand Daniel 7 and map it onto some reality that we ourselves experience. So I'm going to outline two positions that people have used to approach a text like this, and then propose an alternative. The first is what we might label the more historical view, which sees these four beasts as connected in some way to a sequence of real-world empires that would have started in Daniel's own time. Right? The lion represents Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and his son. The bear is then the Persian Empire who conquered Babylon. The leopard then would represent the swift conquest of Alexander the Great as he swept across the world at his point. And the terrifying fourth beast is the Seleucid Empire that ruled after Alexander in the area around Israel. And the Seleucids ruled around 198, just north of Israel. They eventually took it over. And one of their kings was named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And this ruler, this emperor, was brutal. He murdered and tortured Jews in their own temple courtyard. He banned the Hebrew scriptures. He desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. He essentially made it illegal to be Jewish. And many believe that he is the boastful horn mentioned in the vision. So in this view, in some ways, Daniel 7 is describing real-world events from Israel's history living under the rule of empire after empire after empire. Now there's another view, which we might label one that connects more towards a futuristic perspective, right? That's often represented in popular modern-day novels that thinks about these beasts as connected to the past, yes, but also the future, about things yet to happen. They're events that might have started in the past, but that the nastiest empire of all is talking about something to come. That it's a text that might be talking about Jesus' second coming and the end times in some way. Events to take place in Jerusalem in the future for them and for us. So as you think about these two positions, right, people interpret these texts and try to take the sequence of beasts in the vision, and map them onto some earthly reality, either past or future. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say either of these is wrong. There are good scholars who hold to both positions. Right, but I do wonder if we miss the point if we get so caught up in these types of details that we try to take the vision and map it onto some earthly reality, whether past or future. I want to pose another way. And now, I'm not making this up. There are scholars who hold this position. But more importantly, what convinced me to think about it in this way is to think about what Jesus did with this text. Because as I mentioned, this is a text that Jesus quoted from and used, and you find it on the lips of Jesus multiple times. And what we see Jesus do is we see him apply Daniel 7 in a conversation that he has with Caiaphas. And the key word there is apply. Now, we know Jesus thought of this text as really, really important. Right? He used a title from it, the title, the Son of Man. If you've ever watched the show The Chosen, you know that Jesus calls himself the Son of Man repeatedly. It's a title that he uses for himself in exclusion to another title, a title that we so often use of Jesus. Right? We call Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. In that title, Jesus Christ. Jesus never called himself the Christ. This is the title that he uses. He uses this title from Daniel chapter 7. Now, he of course lets others call him Messiah, an Anointed One, and he certainly doesn't deny it. He invites it, but he never uses it of himself. So clearly, he thinks there's something going on in Daniel 7 that we should process and meditate on. Not only does he use that title, but as I said, he quotes from it, and where he does so is in Matthew chapter 26. And so if you want to follow along, you can open up to Matthew chapter 26, and we'll see Jesus quote from this text when he is on trial in front of a ruler, the high priest named Caiaphas. Right, he's being sentenced to death, and Caiaphas is accusing him of wrongdoing. Right, he is the ultimate religious authority. There's other political authorities that are there, that are in this crowd around Jesus as he's being sentenced. And what these political and religious authorities are doing are coming up with these false charges that they know are bogus in an attempt to kill Jesus. They're intentionally persecuting an innocent person because he believes and does things that are different from them, because their power is being diminished and people are starting to follow Jesus. He heals people on the Sabbath. He goes to and cares about the people that they think should be outcasts, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, etc. Right? And they see people flocking to Jesus and his message, and they feel threatened. And so they sentence him to death. As they feel threatened, self-protection takes over. Now let's read just a little bit of this scene in Matthew 26, specifically starting in verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. At last, two came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God, to build it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And so I hope as you heard in those verses, it's clear that Jesus is quoting directly from Daniel 7. He's making a connection between himself and the Son of Man in Daniel's dream. Now you have to remember this situation. The people in front of Jesus know their Bibles really, really well. They are the scholars of the day. And they knew the implications of him quoting from this text. They know exactly what he means. I think first, Jesus is certainly declaring that he is the true representative of humanity, the true human one, who will receive the power, as we'll talk about in a minute. But second, there's another implication. If Jesus is receiving the power, then somebody else is losing it. Right? Power in the dream was taken away from the beasts, the nations that oppress others, and given to the holy ones, to the true people of God, represented by the Son of Man. Right? So if Jesus stands on the side of the holy ones, the people receiving the power, then the people in front of him, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin and the other political leaders, they are the beasts. Right? This is a mic drop moment where Jesus is declaring that he is going to receive power through his actions, and power is going to be taken away from these oppressive rulers of the world. And they know this. Look at his response in Matthew 26:65. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Right, these political leaders are going to sentence him to death even though he's innocent. And as soon as they do, Jesus is declaring that he will be vindicated. He will receive the power, the everlasting kingdom, and be at the right hand of God. Right, in the dream, the power transferred from the beast to the Son of Man. The political rulers lose the power, and Jesus gains it by sacrificing himself. And I think that Jesus' use of this text should make us at least think about how we understand it, how we interpret a text like this. Right? Perhaps he is showing us that our interpretation doesn't have to be tied directly into either of those views that I talked about earlier. Jesus doesn't mention in Daniel 7 that Daniel 7 is some sort of predictive text talking about Caiaphas to come. But it's pretty clear that he thinks the text has implications for his situation. Maybe the text is talking about a type of person. Maybe this apocalypse, which means revelation, reveals to us not necessarily some sort of blueprint of past or future, but it pulls the veil from our eyes so we can see what humans so often tend to do to other humans. And the religious leaders of Jesus' day are putting an innocent man on trial. They're engaging in the actions of that oppressive beast from Daniel chapter 7. And Jesus applies the text in his context, showing us that this text in some way is commentary on humanity, describing a type of person, a king or a kingdom, who seeks to oppress and to dominate others for their own benefit. We might say they become the seeds of the serpent. And Daniel 7, with its outline of beast after beast, sort of shows us that this is so often what human kingdoms turn into, what humans who attain power end up doing to other humans. They stopped acting like humans. They turn into beasts. Right? Think about it. Human kingdoms so often create these systems to dominate others. They want resources and they take them. They want precious metals and they go into a country and they take them. They want oil. They want land and they go get them. They conquer and harm others. This is the history of humans who take power. And the symbols of the chapter, using the language of these beasts, gives us a chance to process this, to process human history and to see that this is so often what humans tend to do. They stopped acting like humans, and instead of having authority over the beast, which is exactly what God commanded humans to do, they turn into that. Right? Go back to Genesis 1 and think about what God said to humanity. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the beasts of the field and the wild animals. In Daniel 7 and elsewhere, humans start acting like these creatures, like these beasts. Perhaps a more modern example of this image from Star Wars might help you connect to this idea. Right, I was watching Star Wars the other day. It was a show called Andor on Disney Plus about 2 weeks ago. And the connection between Daniel 7 and this scene struck me. Right, in this particular show, that the whole premise is the idea that the Galactic Empire wants to take possession of a planet because they want its resources. They need its resources to get enough power to power something like the Death Star. And so they need to take it. But they know if they just go in and conquer the planet that it's going to look bad in the eyes of the other planets in the Senate. So what do? They manipulate the situation. They create a scenario where the rebels they allow the rebels to get the weapons, and they put agitators among the rebels, knowing that eventually the rebels will start the fight. And this is what happens. With the agitators placed, the rebels start a fight, and once the rebels start the fighting, the Empire can put the rebellion down with brutality. And so they step in, they act with violence, they kill thousands because they want the resources of this planet. And they take it. And they do so in a way where they try not to look bad in the eyes of the public. A few realized what was going on, and one particular senator named Mon Mothma was able to speak to the Senate. And in her speech about the empire and its actions, she says this: "The chamber's hold on the truth was finally lost on the Gorman Plaza. What took place yesterday, what happened yesterday on Gorman was unprovoked genocide. Yes, genocide. And that truth has been exiled from this chamber, and the monster screaming the loudest, the monster we helped create, the monster who will come for us all soon enough is Emperor Palpatine." And because of the brutality of the Empire in the Star Wars show and its rulers who plan to build a Death Star, a weapon so powerful that they can crush a planet in an instant to bend people towards their will, the senator calls Palpatine a monster. And if you see the image, he looks that way. I mean, Daniel 7 and the Star Wars show in some ways are commentary, again, on humans seeking power for their own benefit, seeking control of other humans. Now, as we start to push closer towards the end of the message, you might be sitting there and thinking, well, this is not relevant to me. This is empires. This is only a certain type of person. And so I want to try to make this a bit more personal. Because I do think this text has implications for us personally as well. Right, let me ask you just to think about what happens to even the best of people when they're forced to live with a sort of scarcity mindset. When resources are scarce, what do people tend to do? When people know that their resources are limited, I think the tendency that we have as humans is to let something dark within us rise. Right? You could think of these kind of modern post-apocalyptic movies with a situation where systems that we create to give us food and water, grocery stores, running water, they're gone. What happens when two people are in that situation? There's only enough food for one of them. What do people tend to do? They start acting on instinct and they don't care what they do to another human being. Right? If you were to take two lions and put them together and there's only enough food for one of them, the one lion's going to attack the other. And it's not going to think twice about killing the other one so that it can survive. And I think sometimes humans so often act with this mentality as well, that if we find ourselves in a situation where only one can be elevated, only one can succeed, what do we have trouble saying to the other person? Right? Instead of saying, I want you to be the one to succeed, right? The idea of self-protection or self-promotion start to take over, and we want ourselves to succeed. We fight to protect our own interests, and so often it's at the expense of another person. Now, this doesn't just happen in these extreme circumstances that I mentioned a moment ago. It happens in job promotions, in school, in sports, and yes, even in church context. Right? In so many cases where only one person can be honored, only one's going to get the spotlight. What's your reaction, if you're honest? What feeling rises to the surface when you are passed over and somebody else receives the recognition that you want? Maybe you've been working hard, doing your best, and they're celebrated. Does envy start to rise within us? And I think the reality is the impulse to self-protect at the cost of others is something we have seen in the biblical story from the very beginning. And it's a pattern that's repeated throughout the Bible that Jesus, I think, is tapping into. Right, if you think about Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve feel like God is withholding something from them. And instead of exercising that dominion over the beast, what do? They listen to the serpent and they redefine good and evil for themselves. They take and they eat from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then in Genesis 4, you see Cain, see his brother Abel elevated and honored over him, and he can't take it. Envy rises, and God sees it, and God warns him. Sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. The word picture in this verse is intentional. It's powerful. Right? Sin is described in Genesis 4 like a wild animal. Perhaps even a serpent crouching, ready to pounce. And God tells Cain that part of being human is learning to master that impulse to act like a beast. But Cain fails, and so do most others throughout Scripture. But out of that chaos of these first few chapters, the story begins pointing forward. It builds dramatically towards someone, towards an anointed representative who will succeed where others have failed, one who will fulfill humanity's role. The story points forward to this Son of Man who doesn't just model what a human life should look like, but calls all of us into it. Right? And Jesus' use of Daniel 7, I think, is working with this theme. And the whole Bible showing us what it means to be human, showing us how to conquer sin crouching at the door. Jesus is inviting us into that identity. He's inviting us in to the situation where we can rule with him forever and ever. He's showing us how to have that everlasting dominion by becoming a true human. And what's really interesting, if you look at the details of the dream, when Daniel has the dream, it says power goes from the beast to the Son of Man. Well, if you look at the interpretation of the dream again, it doesn't say the power goes to the Son of Man. It says it goes to all the holy ones. There's a clear connection between the one in the dream and the many, all of humanity. We are being invited to process this connection between the one human, Jesus, and all of us as his people. Jesus, I think, is showing us in Matthew 26, again, how to receive the everlasting kingdom, how to receive the power. It doesn't come through conquering. Right? As Jesus shows us, it comes through giving himself up, by always living with that self-sacrificial attitude. Right? Jesus does not act like the beast. He conquers that feeling. He acts like a true human. On the night of his arrest, what does he do? He doesn't fight back. He doesn't protect himself. Instead, he chooses the cross. And I think that's what Jesus is focusing on as he applies this apocalyptic text. It's not to frighten us about what might come, what has been. It's about forming us into a new type of human, a type of human who truly is human. Right? The only thing scary to me in this text is that I see sometimes this potential for all humans to act like this, and even myself to have these feelings that pushes me sometimes to think about acting like this. And so as we conclude our reflection on Daniel 7, I just want to challenge you, perhaps to name one of these urges that push us to act like this sometimes. Maybe it's envy, greed, or pride. And then to think about how you might counteract that with the responses of the Son of Man, the ultimate human one. Service, generosity, or self-sacrifice. Jesus is showing us that's the way to the everlasting kingdom. That's the way that we can rule with God forever and ever. Amen.